Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. I'm pretty sure that's from a movie. It might be copyrighted, but either way, I'm sure the legal process to take me on will be way too arduous for anyone, given we're just getting started here. Wherever you are in the world, it's great to have your company. Thank you so much for joining me here on the Erin Molan Show. It's a big one, and I will say that every single time, but I will mean it every single time. My guest today is General Petraeus. Now, he will be a very familiar name for most of you. Probably the most famous general in America currently living right now, was head of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and also ran the Afghanistan operations for the US forces. Incredibly experienced. He's someone that people from all sides of politics in the US seek advice from. And he's not political in any way. He abstains. But I do ask him regarding Donald Trump whether or not he thinks he's done enough to deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. His answer is very interesting. We also go into all of the global conflicts. I mean, take your pick. We do Russia, Ukraine. His thoughts on Ukraine, I think, really put him at odds with the current administration. He says we should, and when I say we, I mean America and the allied nations, Europe, should give Ukraine everything they need to beat Russia militarily, and long term that's going to be a better outcome for all. Really interesting, because as we know, Donald Trump is not that keen on just basically financing this war. We also talk about Middle East. General goes through exactly how he thinks Israel needs to prosecute and win this war. This is fascinating. He looks a lot into the Battle of Fallujah and uses that as an example, albeit not a perfect one. And I make the point to him, and he agrees, that this is a very different prospect in Gaza, different terrain, different circumstances, different enemy, different civilian population. And I made the point that in Iraq, the hate for the US forces didn't come from birth, in that it was far more realistic for them to go into areas, clear the terrorists out, get the civilian population on side and secure that region. Whereas in Gaza, it's very different. It would be almost impossible. Now, that's at the start of the war. I think there's been a shift, a significant shift in how the population in Gaza view Israel and the IDF. Now, look, they're certainly not going to be showering them with love. It's an age-old hate and something that they've been born into. But what I'm saying is their disgust with Hamas seems to be louder every single day, and more Gazans are being very vocal about that. So I feel like there's more opportunity now. And the general goes through exactly what he thinks they should do in really quite significant detail. We look at China as well, the rising threat of China, which we know is the current threat of China. And I asked General Petraeus whether or not he agrees with General Jack Keane, who made the point about 18 months ago that China, at capacity now, could beat America in a war, and that was 18 months ago. So you wouldn't have thought that China would have gone backwards at all in any way. We know there's a renewed focus in the American military under Defense Sec Pete Hegseth on lethality, which should be essentially the only thing they care about. Not DEI, not anything else that is kind of superfluous to need, not people's feelings. Lethality, the ability of your military to take on an enemy, and that is not about taking them on, it's about the deterrent aspect. So your ability to take them on and beat them, and your willingness to do so. Doesn't mean you need to do it, but your willingness to do so. So fascinating discussion. Let me give you the headlines now, and then we will jump into it because it's a fairly lengthy one. Trump, we told you that he was going to do a press conference on Washington. He has done that press conference now. He has said that he will deploy 800 National Guard troops and take over the police department. Now, he said that he'll do this temporarily to rescue Washington from lawlessness. Have a listen to the president.
This is Liberation Day in D.C., and we're going to take our capital back. We're taking it back under the authorities vested in me as the President of the United States. I'm officially invoking Section 740 of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. You know what that is? And placing the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department under direct federal control. And you people are victims of it, too. You know, you're reporters, and I understand a lot of you tend to be on the liberal side, but you don't want to get mugged and raped and shot and killed. And you all know people and friends of yours that happened. And so you can be anything you want, but you want to have safety in the streets. You want to be able to leave your apartment or your house where you live and feel safe and go into a store to buy a newspaper or buy something. And you don't have that now. The murder rate in Washington today is higher than that of Bogota, Colombia, Mexico City, some of the places that you hear about as being the worst places on earth, much higher. This is much higher. Our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs and homeless people. And we're not going to let it happen anymore. We're not going to take it. Days ago, a former member of the Doge staff was savagely beaten by a band of roving thugs after defending a young woman from an attempted carjacking. He was left dripping in blood. He thought he was dead with a broken nose and concussion. Can't believe that he's alive. He can't believe it. In June, a 21-year-old congressional intern was tragically killed after being hit by a stray bullet in a drive-by shooting. A former Trump administration official named Mike Gill, fantastic person, was murdered last year in cold blood in a carjacking blocks away from the White House. A Democrat congressman was also carjacked at gunpoint not far from the Capitol. And in 2023, an aide to Senator Rand Paul was stabbed in the chest and head by a demented lunatic as he walked down the street, just absolutely for no reason. It's time for dramatic action. We're going to do the same thing over here. It's going to be a very safe city very soon. We're not looking to just take years, because a lot of people die in years. And we've got incredible people in this country, except we have to allow them to do their job. And it's embarrassing for me to be up here. You know, I'm going to see Putin. I'm going to Russia on Friday. I don't like being up here talking about how unsafe and how dirty and disgusting this once beautiful capital was, with graffiti all over the walls. It's another part of it, by the way, because we're talking about safety, but we're also talking about beautification. We have the most beautiful, potentially, capital in the world. We always had. But people come from Iowa, they come from Indiana, they come and then they get mugged. Not going to happen. Keep coming, because by the time you get your trip set, it's going to be safe again, and it's going to be clean very quickly.
Some sad news out of Texas. 3 people have been killed in a shooting at a Target store. Now, the suspected gunman is in custody. He attempted to steal cars afterwards, but 3 deceased people were found in a car park outside Target. Really sad stuff, albeit far too common. Now, Trump has said that he will try and get back land for Ukraine from Russia. Now, this is ahead of his meeting with Putin later on in the week in Alaska. The two are meeting in person. No confirmation yet as to whether or not Zelensky will be there. He said that he wants to be. Clearly, you can very much understand that. Putin has said a couple of days ago that he would halt the entire operation if he could keep this big chunk of Ukrainian land. I mean, I'm banned in Russia. Let me declare that early, because I've called him a warlord. He is a warlord and he is a dictator. But I'm also old enough, ugly enough and big enough to understand that Zelensky will probably have to concede different parts to have this finally over. And I think not that there was ever an appetite in Ukraine for war, but people's patience with it. Everyone just wants it to end, which you can understand. And looking at China, we covered that a little bit with Petraeus. We'll cover it a little bit more, but Trump has extended a pause in higher tariffs for another 90 days. Okay, let's get into this interview now. General Petraeus joined me just a few moments ago, and we covered essentially everything in the world of, well, there's a bit of politics, even though he's not overly keen on talking about it, national security, defence, and essentially the world as we know it, and where he thinks we are going to move towards what direction. So enjoy. General Petraeus, first of all, thank you so very much for joining me. It's really lovely to see you again. Thank you for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure.
I want to start with the state of the world as you see it right now. We caught up maybe a year or so ago, and still in the midst of the war in Ukraine, the Middle East turmoil, but a lot's happened since then. How would you describe it?
It's a work in progress in many, many different respects. The Middle East is transformed, I think. Iran has been truly hammered by the Israeli 12-day campaign, and then the U.S., very impressive U.S. operation to deal with the various nuclear sites that Israel couldn't penetrate. Iran's proxies are damaged or destroyed. Hezbollah, very, very significantly degraded. Syria is no longer an ally to Iran and Hamas, though by no means destroyed, which was the objective of Prime Minister Netanyahu, is again certainly seriously degraded. Whether or not Israel has the right strategy for that, I think, remains in question. But the region itself has been changed, I think, has truly been transformed by what has transpired for Iran and its proxies. Obviously, Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine still fighting very, very hard on the front lines. The losses by the Russians are literally incomprehensible to someone who commanded America's and coalition sons and daughters in two different wars. Very incremental gains for Russia at extraordinary cost, but they do achieve incremental gains. And I think that Putin is still set on achieving what he originally has set out to achieve, and that is to really deny Ukraine its right to exist. He'd like to replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. He'd like to be given more territory than Russia has actually already achieved on the ground. And he'd like to demilitarize Ukraine. None of those three are achievable, and we need to keep his objectives in mind as the meeting between President Trump and President Putin approaches in Alaska on Friday. And then, of course, you have in the global economy the continued uncertainty around some of the U.S. imposed tariffs. Some of the deals have been done, but many certainly have not. Big questions about what will the deal between U.S. and China be in particular, and what kinds of carve-outs and side deals and so forth will be necessary to achieve that. And that, in a way, I think casts a bit of a shadow over the entire global economy, because until you do have certainty, and that's not just abroad, it's not just with America's major trading partners, it's also at home as well, where the business community, consumers all have these lingering uncertainties about what the ultimate tariff rates will be. And that tends to make them pause on major investments and major purchases. And we've just begun to see that. It took a bit longer, perhaps, than many expected, although now with the retroactive changes to the labor statistics, it appears that it did set on earlier than actually the figures reflected for a period of time. So if you take those three, those are major developments in the world, in the developed world. And then you see what's happening with Europe and how this has spurred Europe both to spend a good deal more on defense, something that is a big victory for President Trump, because his predecessors were never able to get them to do that. Obviously, he gets a big assist from Vladimir Putin, who's the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War. But you also see, I think, overlooked Europe starting to take initiatives that could put its economy in a better position, that could foster the kinds of innovation that are so extraordinary in the U.S. right now. What continues, in fact, to lift the U.S. economy is this extraordinary productivity boom that is ongoing, spurred largely by AI, but also by all things digital, robotics, advanced manufacturing, big data, all the rest of that. And you see Europe getting serious about that in the wake of the report that was released by Mario Draghi. And there's a lot in that, I think, that has been a bit overlooked. So there you have, I think, the big pieces. And then you have your country, frankly, which is moving along with a degree of stability in all different respects. I'm sure that that's not seen by those who have their nose to the glass in the wonder down under. But continues its very impressive economic trajectory, is partnering more closely with the U.S. and the Quad and so forth than ever before, and seems to have a degree of pragmatism in what it goes about. And again, I'm non-political, as you know, in the U.S. and also when it comes to Australia, but seems to be quite an enviable situation. And I was just there a few months ago for my annual week in Australia and came away once again very impressed by what I saw going on there, despite, I know, the political back and forth and the election outcome and the rest of that.
General, thank you so much for you have an incredible knack of being able to look at the world and just pick out the really valuable parts and the bits that are very significant. So thank you for that overview. I want to dig a tiny little bit deeper, and I might start with Australia and just get your take on the AUKUS submarine deal. That there's a lot of talk at the moment that may not be going ahead. You've got Elbridge Colby, who's now in a significant position in the White House, who is not a fan, and I think he has said that himself on different occasions. I've had him on the show a few times. Not recently, though. He hasn't been as available recently. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think, there'll be pressure, well, there already is pressure on Australia to increase its spending in defence? Donald Trump is someone who is happy to help as long as you're, lifting your own weight as well.
Well, there is a degree of reciprocity that features in his approach to international relations, foreign policy, and so forth. And by no means is that unreasonable, but it is the approach, I think, that's founded on that of someone who is a real estate developer. And so, again, once you recognize that, you understand it, and there are going to be deals and side deals and all the rest of that, and work your way through that. I'm a supporter of AUKUS. I know that the logistical components of that are a bit challenging. Yeah. The production of that class submarine that we want to loan and so forth is slower than we'd like it to be. We'll see if the Pentagon can speed that up. And I know Bridge, and I respect very much his support for all things Indo-Pacific. I also think, though, that you have to take actions in other parts of the world, because if you don't, you undermine deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Keeping in mind that deterrence is a function of a potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and we're trying to transform those, obviously, but then also of your willingness to use those capabilities on the other hand. And if you don't do right by your other partners and friends and allies elsewhere in the world, that undermines that second component. And I think that's a recognition that sometimes is not seized upon quite as much as it should be. But he has not certainly mentioned his reservations about AUKUS since taking office, and that's appropriate, I think. The key should be to figure out how to make this work. And if the exact details of it right now can't be made to work, then what adjustments will be made? And it can't be a zero sum for either side of the agreement here. This is a partnership. It's an alliance. It's again, the only ally, as we have discussed before, who's been with the U.S. in every single war that we've had of the 20th and 21st centuries. And that does need to be front and center in the relationship.
Looking at China, people continue to use this line, the rising threat of China. I think we're well beyond that in terms of their capability. I'd love to know where you think they stand currently. I think General Jack Keane said maybe 18 months ago that they could win a war against the US. At that stage. I'm assuming they haven't gone backwards since then. I know the US is now focusing a lot more on lethality. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, says that quite publicly and quite often. But where do you think these two superpowers are at in relation to, as you just mentioned, the capability and, just as importantly, the willingness to use it?
Well, I think that, again, China is accurately the pacing threat. That was a term used by the previous administration that I think would be still very much supported by the current administration. I think rightly this administration is focusing even more on the Indo-Pacific than did the previous administration. And again, non-political, I thought the previous administration did a superb job on that component of their foreign policy. You can take issues with others, as I did, with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way it was conducted, the endless debates over key decisions for Ukraine and key weapon systems. But for the Indo-Pacific, I think that was a very strong component of the foreign policy. And this administration is just building on that, just as the previous administration built on the Trump 1.0 change of conversation around China. The key, I think, and everyone recognizes this, is to ensure that the components of deterrence are as rock solid as they can be, and keeping in mind that they're not just the U.S. elements of that equation. Yeah. It's the U.S. plus its allies and partners. And it's great, for example, to see the Philippines renew their old strong ties with the U.S. In the wake of a president in Philippines who flirted, at least for a period of time, with China before he realized that China was not returning his favor. So I think, again, deterrence is quite sound. I would like to see a more rapid evolution of our capabilities, really almost a revolution of our capabilities, to enable the Indo-Pacific Command commander to achieve what he has described publicly as turning the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape for China should they ever try to come across it and forcibly reunify. Admiral Paparo and I have actually discussed that concept in the past. I thought it was wise for him to do the interview with the Washington Post, in which he did unveil that, given that it had been a very sensitive project before that. But now what we need to do is operationalize that, make that real as soon as we possibly can. And I'm a bit worried that we're not moving as fast as we should, especially as we look at what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, where, especially on the Ukrainian side, because they're so heavily outmanned and outgunned, they're throwing thousands of unmanned systems at the Russians on a daily basis. In fact, the last time I was there about 3 or 4 months ago, I asked the Ukrainian commander how many unmanned systems he employed against the Russians the day before, and he said almost 7,000. Now, not all of these are, out and suicide drones. Many of them come back. They're surveillance drones. They're different types of unmanned, actually remotely driven vehicles, because it's so lethal to go from the rear to the front that they actually do it now increasingly by unmanned, remotely driven ground vehicles. The maritime drones that have enabled them to sink 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet without even having a navy of their own. All of this, we need to look much, much more carefully at this. We need to study it much more intently, and we need to overhaul first our concepts for how we might fight something in the Indo-Pacific, and second, how we produce the doctrine, the forces, the materiel, how we change our training, leader development, all the rest of this, so that we are prepared for that kind of conflict, because being prepared for that and visibly being prepared for it in the eyes of a potential adversary obviously is the best way to ensure that it won't happen, to deter it.
Was he the commander? One of them said that this could happen as quickly as maybe next year or the year after. Is that the current Indo-Pacific commander? Are you aware of that? I'm trying to think which one it was. It might have been a former, in terms of China's
this is
attempt to,
the accepted assessment is that it could happen as early as 2027. That's just because that is what President Xi has given as the date by which he wants his military ready to conduct that kind of operation. That doesn't mean by any means that he intends to conduct it then. And let's keep in mind that he may have intentions, but we have agency, and that agency is in the form of how rock solid we make the components of deterrence that I have described.
Let's move now to Russia, Ukraine. You mentioned the meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Zelensky, at this stage, not invited to take part in those talks. Putin has also, according to the Wall Street Journal, said that he will accept a big portion of Ukraine to stop the war. Ukraine has said it won't give up any territory and that it shouldn't have to, which a lot of people agree with. What do you think will need to happen for that war to end? Is Ukraine going to have to give up land?
Well, I think the really big issue here is the security guarantee for Ukraine. You can discuss whether or not they should give up the portions of Donetsk or the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces that the Russians have not yet been able to even approach. And these are what are called the fortress cities. There's about 4 or 5 of them that have been built out very, very substantially as defensive positions. And the Russians would love to be handed those rather than to have to fight for them, because they will be very, very bloody endeavors for the Russians indeed, if they can actually seize them, and that is somewhat in question. If they were to take control of that area, by the way, then the road is open to Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, right on the border with Russia, and other parts of southeastern and eastern Ukraine. So that would be a very, very significant concession on President Zelensky's part. And I cannot conceive of him doing that without an absolute security guarantee, which can only be given by the United States. You can argue that maybe the Russians could give back some parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are two other provinces. It's four provinces in total, plus Crimea, that Russia would like to be given, actually, except that Russia owns those for perpetuity or something like that. And again, that'll be very difficult for President Zelensky to agree to. But at the end of the day, it's really about, okay, if there is a true ceasefire that brings this war to an enduring and durable end, what is it that guarantees that Russia won't start up again, especially given that they would have been given control of the fortress cities? All they'll do, a lot of people believe, and I tend to be among them, is to rebuild their forces, reconstitute whatever it is that they have lost that still has value. And by the way, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles are not survivable on that particular battlefield anymore. It's completely different from what it was even just a couple of years ago. So again, who would make that guarantee? The Europeans tried, but they have never actually succeeded in laying out what it is they would do. The only credible European guarantee would be to put their forces on the front lines with the Ukrainians. And therefore, if the Russians resume their offensive, trying to take additional ground, Europeans will be killed and they will absolutely be in the war alongside the Ukrainians. That's just not something that's conceivable, nor is it necessarily conceivable that they might use standoff weapon systems, perhaps even in a NATO country, to hit Russia if it were to resume the offensive. So at the end of the day, it would have to be the United States. It would have to be a real guarantee. I'm not sure what the shape of that would be, but it would have to be absolutely ironclad. And in the meantime, instead of being demilitarized, as President Putin would like to see Ukraine end up after this ceasefire is agreed, it should be built up even further so that it can ensure the ceasefire. That, the ultimate guarantee is just that Ukraine can defend itself in a way that it cannot even now. I'm still of the view that the best way to get to conditions where Putin might actually be willing to agree to something significant would be to enable Ukraine to the point that Russia can no longer achieve even incremental gains, such as it has been achieving. Again, these are very slow, they're very hard fought, and they're incredibly costly. Russia is estimated to have sustained more than 1 million killed and wounded to this point of this part of the war since 2022. And the number increases on a daily basis. Of that million, it's estimated that over 500,000 were unable to return to their front lines. Either they were killed or so seriously wounded that they couldn't be patched up and sent back. So he's willing to take extraordinary losses that no normal commander-in-chief, head of government or state would be willing to accept, I don't think. But he does. And the way to show him that he cannot achieve more is by arming Ukraine even more than it is. And just sheer money enables them to do more in terms of unmanned systems. They can make the systems. They can find the components. They have the design, the manufacturing, and the individuals to employ them. They believe that they'll make about 3.5 million drones of various types. Again, not just air, but also ground and maritime. And some of them, of course, going deep into Russian territory, as we saw in particular with Operation Spider's Web, where all of a sudden at the same time at bases, strategic Russian air bases, thousands of kilometers apart, they appeared out of the roof of tractor trailers in which they had been hidden. And about $1 million worth of Ukrainian drones damaged or destroyed $7 billion worth of strategic Russian aircraft, enabling them to do even more of that obviously sends a big message to Russia. And of course, each night they're trading huge numbers of drones and missiles, and the Russians dramatically ramping up their activities in that regard, having improved the survivability of their drones by enabling them to fly higher than heavy machine gun can take them out, and also making them larger in terms of their explosive weight. It used to be, you'd be in the streets of Kyiv and you hear the buzzing. It's a very distinctive noise. You can see or hear rounds going up into the air trying to intercept them, and everybody shrugs their shoulders. That is not necessarily the case now. These have become much more lethal than they were in the past.
So are you saying, General, that whether it's America that should be paying for this, Europe, the UK, a combination of all the allied nations, that for more short-term pain now in terms of a bigger financial investment, it will be less pain later because Ukraine will be able to defend itself? Are you saying we should be doing more now so that we have to do less down the track?
Yes, and we should have since the very outset. I think that the U.S. administration did an admirable job in rallying the world in response to the invasion in 2022, but then and did provide enormous quantities of security assistance, various arms, materiel, ammunition, and so forth, as well as other forms of assistance, financial, economic, humanitarian. Though we should note, European countries provided even more in aggregate, not as much as the military, to be sure, from the U.S. And it's really important that no matter what the new mechanism is, the Europeans are going to be the ones providing the support, that they have access to the U.S. missile interceptors for, say, the Patriot ballistic missile system and so forth, because that's crucial. No other country has some of the capabilities that we have provided to Ukraine. And so clearly they're going to need the reloads, if you will, the interceptors, to enable them to continue to use those systems effectively. And were the anti-ballistic missile systems in particular ever to run out, Ukraine would be in a very difficult position. But yes, I've felt from the beginning that U.S. took far too long on making decisions on critical weapon systems, the M1 tanks, without which the Germans weren't going to decide on the Leopards, F-16s. I remember going to senior officials and saying, look, there is no alternative to the F-16. There's no other system that's so ubiquitous in the inventories of our NATO allies and in our own system. You can argue that, that this other system might actually be a bit better for there, but there aren't enough of them, the Gripen, for example. So you're going to have to do this. Why don't you make the decision? The same with the multiple launch rocket system, the longer range Army tactical missile munition, and on and on. And that was maddening for those of us who just wanted to see Ukraine provided all that they could absorb, and to be able to first take back as much of the territory as they could. You'll remember they did quite a bit of that in late 2022 and into 2021. The subsequent summer offensive did not achieve what a lot of us had hoped it would, in part just because of the very, very strong Russian defenses, but also because we hadn't provided critical systems when we assumed that they would be available for the Ukrainians. And since then, largely since really the summer of 2021 or the fall of largely since the summer of 2023 and that fall, the lines have been generally pretty static, with the Russians periodically achieving some incremental gains. They do accumulate a bit, but none of those have been truly strategic. And you also had, of course, the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk province in Russia, which eventually had to be withdrawn under pressure from the Russians. So again, largely static lines, horrific casualties, especially on the Russian side, and now tactics that are essentially hands full of infantrymen running forward to the next tree line or the next across the street. Occasionally Russians also on e-bikes or electric motorcycles because they don't make noise. No front lines the way you used to have those trenches. Now they're more combat outposts, and they actually allow the Russians to bypass them, and then they'll go back and police them up later. So again, a very, very different war from the first 2 years of it, and a war in which unmanned systems on both sides are incredibly ubiquitous and very, very lethal. In fact, now on both sides, there's actually the installation of steel mesh or other type of mesh over the main supply routes, the roads to and from the rear to the front, so that they can run vehicles back and forth without getting hit directly. Although there are already videos, of course, especially from the Ukrainian side, which does this so well, that show them getting around the edges of those screens, that netting, and then tracking down the Russian vehicles underneath it. So again, what should we do? Everything we can as quickly as we can to help Ukraine just stop the Russians cold and convince them that they cannot achieve further gains at even the incredible cost that Russia has been willing to sustain.
I'm going to take you to another part of the world, and I'm conscious of your time. I promise I could talk to you for hours. The Middle East, if you were commander in chief right now, a very different set of circumstances, very different terrain, very different enemy. How would you end the war in Gaza today if you could?
Well, I don't think you can actually end the war in Gaza at an acceptable situation for Israel without changing the strategy. And I've said this from the very beginning publicly to the defense minister of Israel in articles in foreignaffairs.com, et cetera, that what Israel should have been doing all along is essentially a counterinsurgency campaign in which you clear, hold, build, and very slowly transition control to Palestinian forces, starting in the north, working your way south, with gated communities created, population control measures that also employ biometric ID cards for those who are allowed to go back into the areas where their homes were, and then very careful big walls that keep the Hamas out once you have cleared an area. The problem is that they've been doing what's called clear and leave or raid and leave. And Hamas is probably still about the same strength it was at the beginning, though by no means are they as capable or combat effective companies, battalions, brigades. They're not as coherent. The communications is obviously disrupted and so forth, but they are still the most guys with the most guns. Look, I wanted Israel to achieve its three objectives, as stated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, to destroy Hamas, not just degrade them, which is what they have done, destroy them forever. And not allow them to come back, keep Hamas from governing again, obviously. And there's no real government in Gaza now, but there still is some sort of quasi government, if you will. And apparently, Hamas has such huge reserves of funding that they're still, in some respects, actually distributing some money to some members of the organization, and then to ensure that all the hostages are recovered. And none of those threes has been fully achieved, much less a fourth objective that I felt should have been established from the very beginning as well, which is to provide a better future for the Palestinian people in Gaza without Hamas in their lives. And the only way to do that is clear, hold, build, transition. And yes, it's very manpower intensive. It can be costly in certain respects, but the casualties continue right now. Yeah. Israel talks
Is
about
that what you did in the Middle East?
percent of the territory. It actually.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's what we did during the surge.
Yes.
We had been doing clear and leave, essentially, or clear and hand off to Iraqi forces that were no longer combat effective because the civil war had reached such terrifying levels of violence by late 2006. So in early 2007, when President Bush announced the decision to surge additional forces, the real surge that mattered most was a change in ideas. It was a surge of ideas, the change in strategy from clear and leave to clear and hold, build, transition very slowly, rebuild the Iraqi forces so they could hold the ground as we slowly transition to them, et cetera. For example, Fallujah was 300,000 people. We told them, we're coming in, we're going to get al-Qaeda out of your lives. And for this time, we're going to keep al-Qaeda out, because we're going to live with you in your neighborhoods, and we're going to create big walls, gated communities. They spend a lot of money in Florida for a gated community. We're going to give it to you for free. We'll control the entry control point until we have trusted partners that can do that. You'll have a biometric ID card that allows you to come and go from your neighborhood, but only your neighborhood and then common areas. And there was a lot of doubt because we'd gone in and killed a lot of bad guys before and then left and they came back. In this case, we stayed. And a great Marine and Army force cleared that area really quite quickly, relatively speaking, a matter of weeks. And it bounced back very, very quickly. This has never been done in Gaza. The people have been pushed around. Obviously, there's a huge humanitarian crisis, frankly, that has been built up there. The challenges of trying to provide food to the people because you don't have security.
Yeah.
There's a famous, iconic figure from Vietnam named John Paul Van, who used to say that security may be 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Whatever it is, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. Without it, you can't do these other things.
Yeah.
I remember during the early months of the surge, the development experts and others would say, well, General, we'd like to do this here now. And I said, look, we don't have security there yet. When we do have security, however, we want you to come in because that's what solidifies the security gains. It's what you do now to show the people that life will be better than it was when Al-Qaeda or the Iranian-supported Shia militia were in their neighborhoods. And they should support this effort rather than oppose it because it's going to be better for them. And that happened in community after community. Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, Mosul, Samarra, you name it, even parts of Baghdad in which we used a lot of the walls as well. And that's what should be the approach there. It should have been from the beginning. The taking of Gaza City, I don't know what taking means. If you don't, again, employ population control measures, even if you clear the entire city of 1 million people of Hamas, and that's a very, very challenging task, if you don't then segment it and keep them out using walls and so forth, you won't have achieved anything. And then if you don't get the people back into the areas where their homes are so they can be provided better shelter first and then rebuild homes, schools, clinics, roads, bridges, markets, and all the rest of that. And again, the idea that Arabs will go in there and fight Hamas for Israel is just not realistic. So I still find real concerns about the approach that's being taken. By the way, again, we by no means got it always right. It took us 7 or so years in Afghanistan just to get the big ideas right, another year to get the inputs right, and then we only kept them right for about 6 months before we started drawing down. And eventually that drawdown became more based on conditions in Washington than it was based on conditions in Afghanistan. By the way, we didn't need to end that, quote, endless war. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. The cost was not prohibitive at all. The allies all wanted to stay. There were 3 times as many of them as we were. So again, you sometimes have to challenge this wisdom, supposed in quotes, that says you must end endless wars. In the case of Gaza, you've just got to get the strategy right and conduct a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign. Hamas is now very much insurgents, guerrillas. They're not a formal army that can be fought and decisively defeated and they never resurrect. They just keep replacing their losses. There's no end of angry young men who are unemployed, willing to take up a weapon. They're not as effective, they're not as capable, but they can still kill Israelis, and they've been doing that on a fairly regular basis. And you don't have real something to show for it. You don't control actual areas. So that's the question I have about this. Is taking Gaza City, what does that mean? How does it manifest itself on the ground? Will there be the kind of population control measures that should have been employed from the very beginning so that when you clear Hamas from an area, you can keep them out and you just keep going after them progressively? I said do it from north to south, come a kilometer in, east-west wall, 3 north-south walls, you have 4 gated communities. And walls are easy to put up, by the way. We did miles and miles and miles of walls every night with every single unit that was engaged in these counterinsurgency campaigns. So that would be my counsel. Again, I've offered it before. I understand that there's no counterinsurgency field manual. I know they have not done it before. These are the most adaptive, innovative, capable soldiers in the world. They'll pick this up very, very quickly. There's no rocket science. about going from home to home to home and clearing every building, floor, room, cellar, and blocking every tunnel entrance, and doing it progressively so the enemy can't come in behind you and reoccupy some area that you've already cleared. They can do that very quickly and then try to get the people back into these areas. And now, because there's security, you can give out food without confrontations that result in shooting and this kind of thing. You have security, and security has not been established anywhere in Gaza, with the exception of within the Israeli bases, and that's not where it counts. It's where it counts is with the population itself, and whether they can be provided humanitarian assistance, then restoration of basic services, then reconstruction. And over time, then you'll get Arab forces that will come in to help out, because they're not fighting against fellow Arabs. Even if they hate Hamas, they're not going to go in and fight Hamas for Israel.
I feel like, and you know far more about this than I do in a million ways, but initially the population, I think, were very much more supportive of Hamas and in terms of their vehement hate for Israel and for the Jewish population. Now I think that's shifted.
No question about it.
We're
Sure.
starting to see that rhetoric come out where they are angry at Hamas, and it would now be an opportunistic time for Israel to come in and we can help you live a life without them. And whereas at the start of the war, it just wouldn't have been possible. But now I think the population would be very, very open to that.
I think that's a very correct assessment. I'd be careful to say that they would welcome Israelis. I think they'll
No.
only welcome Israelis once they see their lives are demonstrably better, because the Israelis have gotten Hamas out of their lives. There's still huge residual support for Hamas for fighting against the Israeli Defense Forces and so forth and so on. But I think you're right that I think the people, look, at this point, they just want to survive. They are at the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the level of food, water, and shelter. And if someone provides that to them, I think that they will very quickly overlook any historic animosity and come to accept that that's a better life for them. And then as it gets better and better, as was the case again in Fallujah, which was arguably the toughest. But again, keep in mind, much, much smaller than even Gaza City, not even a third the size of Gaza City, no tunnel infrastructure such as you have there. So Gaza is much, much more challenging than all of our difficult urban fights put together. But nonetheless, the appropriate way to go at it is what we have been discussing here.
General, a couple more really quick ones. I know you don't get political, so I'm not asking you to endorse the current administration, the old one, but I want to ask you about the Nobel Peace Prize and these. I mean, I was about to say there are calls for Donald Trump to receive it, but I think he's been part of that himself as well, as he tends to do. Do you think that he deserves that kind of, I guess, that accolade, given what he's managed to do? And you look at Iran, what he might do with Russia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, we saw this week, India, Pakistan. What are your thoughts on whether or not that would be an appropriate award?
Well, certainly if he were to bring the war in Ukraine to a durable, enduring, and absolutely solid end, keeping in mind that, by the way, the Ukrainian people would like to see an end to this war now as well. They don't like having to give up their territory. They certainly would not like to give up the fortress cities. They know that these defenses are so very important, and Zelensky has to keep that in mind. But were he to achieve some kind of, again, durable, enduring, U.S. guaranteed ceasefire and eventually end of the war, I think that he would be a very legitimate candidate. By the way, the situation with Azerbaijan and Armenia, that's not trivial.
No.
That provides a tremendous alternative for the Caucasus to access Turkey and then Europe and so forth. And of course, that was agreed by two countries that have been fighting as recently as last year, when, of course, the Armenians lost their enclave within Azerbaijan. So I think it was a realistic appraisal by the Armenian leader in particular, but also the Azeri leader. And again, something that was on very few radar screens. It was on mine for a variety of reasons, but this also cuts Iran out of their aspirations for being an outlet from the Caucasus. It also is a challenge to the Belt and Road initiative. that's a pretty big deal. We need to see if it manifests itself. Again, sometimes these kinds of solutions sound great, they brief well, and then you have to see if the Trump corridor, as it's called, is truly going to materialize or not. If it does, that's really, really big. The Middle East is still a work in progress. I'd be cautious there. We need to do a lot more to help Syria, to try to help President al-Shara achieve what he's trying to achieve, but which many of those around him are making very difficult. And again, I think the decision on Iran was the right decision. So yeah, no, look, again, it's by no means yet, come across the hurdle or wherever the bar is. I think that's a pretty high bar. But it's not inconceivable. And just because he is Donald Trump doesn't mean that he shouldn't aspire to that, or actually that it's unrealistic that he could actually achieve that.
Final question. You're 10 years younger than Donald Trump and even younger than the president prior to Donald Trump. Any political aspirations for you? And I know that you've had
No, not at all.
decades of people, not even a tiny chance. As I said, you're still a decade younger than the current president.
And did 2 tough workouts back to back on my bike yesterday. No, is the answer. Look, I decided to stop voting when I was promoted to 2-star general.
I read that.
That was all the way back the year before the invasion of Iraq. I've never resumed voting. I've never endorsed a candidate. I don't support candidates. I don't contribute. I do talk to candidates of either party. I do talk to members of Congress. It's a unique position, actually, because nowadays it's almost as if people can't be photographed with someone who is from another party sitting down and actually discussing issues. So there's a degree of, again, uniqueness to this that enables certain activities. I talked to people in the administration. He considered me for the administration, the Trump 1.0. And actually I was called one night and said, okay, they're going to announce you tomorrow for Secretary of State. That happened to be the night that he had dinner with Rex Tillerson. And I'd asked for a couple more meetings I needed to do a few more details about that possibility. But so no, is the answer. I think you have to actually realistically look at your politics or your views relative to the 2 different parties. We have partisan primaries that candidates have to get through. I'm quite realistic about that. I remember the then head of Fox TV one time said at a dinner party in New York, if you'll run for president, I'll give you $1 billion of my own money. And I turned to him and said, you've never even asked me my views. And so he said,
that's one hell of an endorsement.
But no, that's not the case.
Would you take $2 billion?
Anyway,
Would 2 get you over the line? General,
yeah, let's get the bidding war going.
General, I think your ability to contribute in an effective way is because of the stance that you have, and I'm sure you do tenfold what we can discuss behind the scenes for your country and in turn for my country and the rest of the world. So thank you for your service, both past and present, and thank you so very much for your time and for being so generous with it. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. It's always a great privilege to be with you. Again, I remember your dad very, very fondly. And also I remember the Diggers with whom I was privileged to serve in 2 different wars or 2.5 wars, whatever, very fondly as well. They're extraordinary.
They really are. General, thank you so much again. He's amazing, isn't he, General Petraeus? And we thank him very much for his time. Dad is someone that was clearly a huge part of my life. We lost him a couple of years ago, but at some stage I'll tell you all about him. He was a retired Major General, ran the war in Iraq for a year on behalf of the US troops and the coalition forces, was also an Australian senator and holds the record for the most individual votes of any politician in Australian history, an incredibly special man. I love this mentality that people die twice, once when they take their final breath and the second time when people stop saying their name. So I love it so much when people bring up my dad, any opportunity to talk about him. Now, let's go into a little bit of feedback before I bid you farewell, because this has been a very long episode. Erin, this is from Gigi. I love your content, but it looks like you are in a torture dungeon. Are you okay? Should we have a march to free you? I really like this background, but I get what you're saying. And I could be convinced to lighten it up a little bit, but I really like it. Tell us you're a Jew. This is from Anon. Gee, what a surprise. Tell us a Jew signs your paycheck without telling us a Jew signs your paycheck. I mean, if there is some kind of place where you do get paid for standing up for what is right, when you do get paid for condemning terrorism, when you do get paid for standing up for a democratic nation, let me know. But no, I haven't found it yet, even though I think I would qualify. Thank you, Erin, for seeing and spreading the truth. They may have won another small battle, but in the end, justice and truth will prevail. I tend to agree. Scott says, what the hell happened to Australia over recent years? How did you guys manage to put in such losers to be in charge of the country? We need people who are like-minded with Erin back in charge. Make Australia great again. Now, I will sometimes read out semi-compliments about myself, and only because, and as you get to know me, you'll understand this, there are so many mean ones. So when I get a good one, and look, there's lots of good ones too. God bless you guys are beautiful. But it helps, right? It's balance, and it makes me feel good. And I feel like it helps the people who write them as well. It makes them feel good too. That's completely my only motivation. Excellent satire, right to the point, says Paul. I'm a Canadian. I do not recognise the fictional Palestine state. A weak, stupid Liberal government issued the meaningless statement. You know, the issue with this, it's not, I care about innocent people in Gaza, we should give them a state. That makes zero sense. It does nothing for them. What it does is reward Hamas, the terrorists, for October 7 and for keeping hostages. There's still 50 there, suffering, dying, dead in tunnels, still alive. But it's horrific. And we've now essentially said, great job, you guys. Well done. We're going to reward you by recognising you and giving you a statehood. I mean, it's absolutely insane. So don't confuse this with doing something good for people in Gaza. It's the complete opposite. Australian government is an embarrassment, Erin. You're a light in the dark. Gosh, bless you. So Australia is now a state sponsor of terrorism. Is anyone surprised? A. Smith says, Erin, today's a day of shame for our country and our reputation as a decent democratic society. Albo and Wong have turned our collective backs on our Jewish friends and have given terrorists legitimacy they have no right to have. What the hell is wrong with these people? When the terrorists who started this, who defiled women and babies on October 7, who hide in tunnels underneath their own people, sacrificing them for their own benefits, are supported by a country like our own. Brilliantly said. Apple Mac says Western governments keep on going in this direction. Yes, they do. Daniel says stupidity and cowardice is contagious. God bless Erin, one of the few wise and brave voices in this corrupt world. Bless you. Bless you. I'm 76 years old, says Will, and I've never been ashamed to be an Australian, but thanks to Albo, Wong, Burke and Co, you have succeeded in making me do so. I've had family in all theatres of war since 1914. What a sad day. That is really, really sad. And let me just give you one final one to end on. And no, it's not complimentary. I'm not that punishing this early. George Basson says, I must get my YouTube feed fixed. All I heard was blah, 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 blah. Well, you know what, Jeff, whatever your name is, the views that we record or the listens don't care what you hear. They just care that you play it and you listen. Your listen, your watch counts. So thank you so much for engaging. Thank you for listening. And I hope you listen and hear blah, 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 blah for every episode from here on in. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for watching, for listening, however you are absorbing this, however you are taking this show in. I really appreciate your support, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow. Looking forward to it. Have a great, gosh, do I need to do this again? A great morning, afternoon, evening, or night, whichever tickles your fancy. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.